Welcome to Karma Chronicles, the channel where what goes around comes around in the most satisfying ways. If you believe in justice and payback, you're in the right place. Today's story is a perfect example of why you should never underestimate the underdog. It's 9 p.m. on New Year's Eve, and my landlord has just tossed everything I own onto the street in the cold. He's just standing there, arms crossed, with this smug look on his face while I stare at my entire life packed into garbage bags on a snowy curb. He tells me, "Good luck finding a lawyer on a holiday." He thought he was untouchable. He figured the timing, the holiday, the sheer shock of it all would leave me broken. He saw me as a problem to be swept away, a little speed bump in his big plan. What he didn't know was that by January, I wouldn't need a lawyer just to get my apartment back. I would be the reason he lost his entire building. This isn't just a story about an illegal eviction. This is a story about how a little bit of knowledge, a refusal to play the victim, and a landlord's own greed can bring his whole empire crashing down. And it all started in less than 30 days. So let's rewind. To get how I ended up homeless on the biggest party night of the year, you have to get the guy I called my landlord. We'll call him Mr. Harrison. Harrison wasn't your normal landlord who fixes leaky faucets and collects rent. He saw himself as a real estate mogul, a shark. He owned my building, a modest 6-unit walk-up in a rapidly gentrifying part of the city, but he was always talking about his portfolio and his acquisitions. He drove a car that was way too expensive for the neighborhood and wore suits that were way too slick. He always seemed impatient, like he was on his way to a meeting that was more important than you. I'd lived in my apartment for 3 years. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. Great light close to my job, and the rent was, for the city, actually reasonable. I paid on time every single time. I was the perfect tenant, quiet, clean, and basically invisible. For 2.5 years, the only time I ever heard from Harrison was when he cashed my rent checks. But then, about 6 months ago, things started to get weird. The neighborhood was heating up. A new luxury condo tower went up a few blocks away. Trendy coffee shops and expensive boutiques started popping up where the old laundromats and delis used to be. You could just feel the money flowing in, and Harrison could smell it more than anyone. He started getting aggressive. First, it was the inspections. He'd show up with less than an hour's notice, walking through my apartment with developers, pointing at walls and talking about blowing this out or reconfiguring the floor. It was invasive and really unsettling. Then came the pressure. He started offering tenants money to leave. At first, it was a couple of $1,000s. Most of us, me included, said no thanks. We had stable homes and couldn't afford to go anywhere else. His offers got more and more insulting. He'd corner you in the hallway, ranting about how the building was a dump and he was doing us a favor. He wanted us out, and he was losing his patience. He planned to empty the building, do a cheap, cosmetic renovation, and then flip it to a developer for a huge profit. The only problem was us, the tenants, with our legally protected leases. My lease wasn't up for another 8 months. I knew my rights, or I thought I did. I knew he couldn't just kick me out without a valid reason, but I seriously underestimated his audacity. That week between Christmas and New Year's is always a weird, quiet time in the city. Everyone's either out of town or in a food coma. My work was closed, and I was looking forward to a quiet week at home. On December 29th, an envelope slides under my door. It wasn't a holiday card. It was a notice crudely typed out saying I had to be out by December 31st. The reason? Nuisance behavior. It was laughable. I was the quietest person in the building. The only nuisance I was causing was existing in an apartment he wanted to be empty. I knew it was bogus. The law in my state is crystal clear. For any legitimate issue, a landlord has to give you proper written notice, and they usually have to give you time to cure whatever the problem is. To terminate a lease, it's typically a 30-day notice. He gave me 2. I tried to call him, straight to voicemail. I emailed him, pointing out that his notice was illegal. No response. I figured he was just trying to scare me and that he'd back down when he saw I wouldn't be bullied. I was wrong. New Year's Eve rolls around. I had plans to go to a friend's get-together later that night. Around 7 p.m., there's a loud banging on my door. It's Harrison, and he has 2 huge guys with him. Not cops, not marshals, just big. "You got my notice," he says, not a question. "I did," I said through the door. "And you know it's not a legal notice. You need a court order to evict someone, Harrison." He laughed, that smug, grating laugh. "A court order? It's New Year's Eve, courts are closed, the city is closed, nobody cares, you're out. Either you open this door or we will." My heart was pounding. This could not be happening. This is the stuff you read about in horror stories. It's called a self-help eviction, and it's incredibly illegal. Landlords can't use force to remove a tenant. They have to go through the courts. Only a sheriff or marshal can legally carry out an eviction, and never on a holiday. He was breaking multiple laws at once. I held my ground. "I'm not opening the door. If you try to break in, I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," he sneered. "Call them. By the time they get here, the locks will be changed, and your junk will be on the sidewalk. They'll tell you it's a civil matter and to take it to court. A court that won't be open for days. Happy New Year." And that's exactly what happened. I called 911, my voice trembling. While I'm on the phone, I hear a drill. They're drilling out my lock. I threw my weight against the door, a totally useless, desperate move. Within minutes, the door burst open. The 2 men walked in and just started grabbing my things, not carefully. They were yanking clothes out of drawers and stuffing them into black contractor bags. Books were swept off shelves, my laptop tossed in a box with kitchen pans. It was a violation. It felt violent and terrifying. I was screaming at them to stop, that this was illegal. Harrison just stood in the doorway, filming me with his phone, a sick grin on his face. "Keep it up," he said. "This is great for my nuisance complaint." The police showed up about 20 minutes later. Just like Harrison predicted, they were hesitant. They saw my stuff on the curb, the new lock on the door, and a landlord calmly explaining he was dealing with a problem tenant who refused to leave. I was hysterical, trying to explain the law that he needed a court judgment. They just looked tired. It was New Year's Eve. They had bigger fish to fry. "This is a civil matter, ma'am," one of them said, a line that felt like a death sentence. "You'll have to take it up with your landlord in housing court." And just like that, I was standing on a snowy sidewalk, surrounded by my life in garbage bags. Harrison got back in his shiny car, gave me one last look, and drove off, probably on his way to a champagne toast. I was left alone in the cold on New Year's Eve. The feeling of hopelessness was absolute. It was the lowest point of my life. I didn't just feel evicted, I felt erased. The first few hours were a blur of shock, and just being so cold. I called my friend whose party I was supposed to be at. She and her husband left their own celebration and came to get me right away. We loaded as much of my life as we could into their car, shoving the rest under a tarp on the sidewalk, a sad little monument to my humiliation. I spent that night on their couch, listening to the distant cheers and fireworks as the clock struck midnight, feeling completely and utterly defeated. The next few days were a nightmare. January 1st was a holiday. The courts were closed. Legal aid offices were closed. I was stuck. I was homeless, living out of a suitcase at my friend's place. The emotional toll was unreal. I couldn't sleep. I just kept replaying the scene over and over in my head. The drill, Harrison's laugh, the cop's tired eyes. It wasn't just about losing my apartment. It was the brutal injustice of it. The feeling of being totally powerless. And that's a feeling that can either break you, or it can forge you into something much, much stronger. For about 48 hours, it almost broke me. I was looking at emergency shelters online, trying to figure out how much money I had and how long I could last in a cheap motel. Despair was suffocating me. Harrison had been right. He picked his moment perfectly. He used the holiday as a weapon against me, leaving me stranded with nowhere to turn. The turning point came on January 2nd. It wasn't some big, dramatic moment. It was a quiet click of a mouse. My friend saw the state I was in and sat me down at her computer. "Stop looking at shelters," she said. "Start looking at lawyers." But I couldn't afford a lawyer. That was the whole point. Harrison knew it. That's the power dynamic he was counting on. My friend, though, was more stubborn than I was. She started typing, and I just watched, numb. She wasn't just searching for lawyers. She was searching for tenant rights, illegal eviction, and NYC landlord harassment. And that's when we found it. Not a law firm, but a community. A forum for tenants' rights advocates. It was filled with stories, resources, and most importantly, anger. There were people just like me, people who had been cheated and bullied by landlords who thought they were above the law. Reading their stories, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't despair, it was rage. Then I saw a post that changed everything. It was from a user describing a situation almost identical to mine. A landlord trying to clear out a building for a sale using harassment. The post ended with this piece of advice. Your landlord's greatest strength is that he owns the building. His greatest weakness is also that he owns the building. A building is an asset, but it's also a liability. You just have to find the leverage. That word just echoed in my head. Harrison had all the power because he had the property and the money. But what if that property was his Achilles heel? What if, instead of just fighting to get my little apartment back, I could make the building itself the problem? That was it. The switch flipped. The fear was still there, but now it was being shoved aside by this cold, clear sense of purpose. He thought he threw me out on the street. He had no idea he had just thrown me into a library. He wanted me to disappear. Instead, I decided I was going to become the biggest problem he ever had. My goal wasn't just to get my home back anymore. My goal was to make him regret ever learned my name. The fight wasn't just about me. It was about every tenant he'd ever walked over. And I would use his own building, the source of his power and his greed, as the weapon to do it. This was the moment the whole game flipped. And if you live for these moments of epic payback, make sure you hit that subscribe button to join us here at Karma Chronicles. You won't want to miss what comes next. Now, let's get into the strategy. The next few weeks were a crash course in how to become a legal nightmare. I lived and breathed tenant law. My friend's dining table became my war room, covered in printouts from legal aid sites and city housing department pages. I learned the specific language of the law. This wasn't just an illegal eviction. It was an illegal lockout and a wrongful detainer, crimes with specific and severe penalties. My first real step was to document everything. I went back to my old building and took pictures of the new lock. I took a video of myself trying my key, showing that it wouldn't work. I gathered bank statements showing my perfect, on-time rent payments. I saved the threatening notice. I wrote down a detailed, time-stamped account of everything that happened on New Year's Eve. Evidence was my new religion. Then I started digging into Harrison himself. Public records are a beautiful thing. I looked up the ownership records for my building, which was owned by a shell company, an LLC. But a little more digging on the city's database connected that LLC to other LLCs, and they all led back to one person, Harrison. I found out he didn't just own my 6-unit building. He owned 3 other similar buildings. His portfolio. This was interesting. A pattern of behavior is so much more powerful than a single incident. I decided to take a walk. I visited his other 3 buildings. They were in similar neighborhoods, a bit worn down, but clearly in areas on the verge of blowing up. I started talking to the tenants. At first, people were scared. They knew their landlord and didn't want to make waves. But then I'd tell them my story. I'd show them the picture on my phone of my stuff on the curb, and I would see this flicker of recognition in their eyes. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with anger. It turned out that Harrison was running the same playbook everywhere, harassing long-term tenants. Ignoring repairs makes their lives miserable, offering everyone insulting lowball buyouts. He was systematically trying to empty all 4 of his buildings. My illegal eviction wasn't a one-off, it was an escalation. He was testing the waters to see what he could get away with. This was the key. This was the leverage. I found 2 other tenants in my old building who he was harassing, plus 3 more across his other properties who had been documenting his neglect for months. We formed a small, secret alliance, a tenants' association in the making. Now we had stories, we had evidence, but we needed to hit him where it would actually hurt, his wallet. My research into housing law led me to a crucial discovery. That past spring, in 2024, the state had passed a game-changing, good cause eviction law. This law was a huge deal, especially as it rolled out in cities like mine. It meant that for most apartments, landlords couldn't evict a tenant without a proven good cause, like not paying rent or destroying the place. It also put a cap on how much they could raise the rent. Harrison's entire business model, clearing out buildings to cash in on gentrification, was now fundamentally illegal. His nuisance claim against me was a desperate, fraudulent attempt to get around that law. But then I found something even better. While digging through the city's Department of Buildings database, I noticed something odd about my building. Harrison had filed for permit. S for minor plumbing work and electrical updates over the past year, but I knew for a fact that work was never done. He had a plumber sign off on work that never happened. Why? I kept digging, cross-referencing the building's records with the Department of Finance. And there it was, the smoking gun. Harrison had refinanced my building 10 months ago. He'd taken out a massive mortgage on it, pulling out every dime of equity he could. To get that loan, the bank required the building to be in good standing, free of major violations, and fully occupied. Those fake permits for plumbing and electrical work, they were submitted as proof to the bank that the building was well-maintained and worth the high value he was claiming. He had lied to the bank. He had committed bank fraud. My heart was pounding as I printed everything out. This was it. This was the leverage that could bring his whole house of cards down. The illegal eviction was a symptom of his desperation. He had this massive loan, and the new good cause law meant he couldn't kick tenants out legally to flip the building and pay it off. So he resorted to illegal tactics. But his original sin, the thing that made him truly vulnerable, was the fraud he committed to get the loan in the first place. I gathered all my evidence, my illegal lockout documentation, the stories from the other 5 tenants, the proof of the fake permits, and the details of the refinancing loan. I didn't need a lawyer to sue for my security deposit. I needed a strategy that would cause a catastrophic failure of his entire business. We decided on a 3-pronged attack. First, I filed an illegal lockout case in housing court. This was straightforward. I asked to be let back into my apartment immediately, plus damages. Second, our new little tenants association filed a collective complaint with the city's Department of Housing Preservation and Development, documenting the pattern of harassment and neglect across all his buildings. Third, and this was the kill shot, I wrote a letter, not to Harrison. It was addressed to the vice president of commercial real estate at the bank that held his mortgage. The letter was polite, professional, and absolutely devastating. I introduced myself as a tenant who had just been illegally evicted. I laid out, with meticulously organized evidence, that Mr. Harrison was engaged in a pattern of illegal activity to defy state law. And then I dropped the bomb. I included the records showing the fraudulent permits. I attached a copy of his loan application and put it right next to the evidence that the work was never done. I essentially told the bank, the collateral for your multi-million-dollar loan is a fraudulently represented asset managed by someone who is actively breaking state and city laws, and who is now the subject of multiple legal actions that will tie up the property and prevent any sale. I sent the letter by certified mail on January 20th. I had no idea if it would work, but I had turned over all the cards. Now, all I could do was wait. The first response came from the city. The housing department moved surprisingly fast. A coordinated complaint from tenants across a landlord's entire portfolio sets off major alarm bells. They scheduled an emergency inspection of all 4 of Harrison's buildings. Inspectors found everything: widespread electrical problems, faulty plumbing, and broken fire safety equipment. Within a week, his buildings were covered in violation notices. The fines were already climbing into the tens of thousands of dollars, with strict deadlines for major, expensive repairs. His plan for a cheap renovation was dead. At the same time, my housing court date arrived for the illegal lockout hearing. Harrison showed up, looking smug with his slick lawyer. His lawyer tried to paint me as a disgruntled tenant. Then I presented my evidence: the photo of my stuff on the curb, the video of the drilled-out lock, and my perfect rent history. I calmly explained the law. The judge's expression hardened. He looked right at Harrison. "Did you physically remove this tenant and her belongings from her apartment without a court-ordered warrant of eviction executed by a city marshal?" he asked. Harrison's lawyer tried to jump in, but the judge cut him off. "I'm asking your client." Harrison stammered, I had cause." "That is for this court to decide, not you," the judge said, his voice dangerously low. "You engaged in an illegal eviction. The law is not a suggestion." The ruling was immediate. I was to be restored to my apartment within 24 hours, with Harrison paying for the locksmith. He was ordered to pay damages for the illegal lockout, which ended up being a significant 5-figure sum. The judge then looked at Harrison and noted that this kind of self-help eviction wasn't just a civil matter, but could carry criminal charges. Harrison's face went white. This was not how this was supposed to go. But the final blow hadn't even landed yet. That came 3 days later. I got a call from a lawyer from the bank that held Harrison's mortgage. My letter had not gotten lost. "We have received your correspondence," she said, all business. "We take these allegations very seriously. We have launched our own internal review of Mr. Harrison's loan portfolio." An internal review, after being handed evidence of fraud, is code for "we're protecting ourselves." The confrontation I'd been waiting for happened in the hallway of my building. I was there to meet the locksmith. Harrison came storming in, his face blotchy and red. The smugness was gone, replaced by pure panic. "You," he yelled, pointing at me. "What did you do?" "I stood up for my rights, Mr. Harrison," I said calmly. "My bank called me," he said, his voice cracking. "They're starting foreclosure proceedings. They're freezing my assets. Do you know what that means?" I knew exactly what it meant. If you commit fraud to get a loan, the bank can call you in default and move to seize the asset. He didn't have the cash. He was leveraged to the hilt. "They said they're appointing a receiver," he was rambling now. "The building is covered in violations. No one will buy it like this. No one will refinance it. You ruined me." There it was. The moment the bully realized his castle was made of sand. He looked at me, expecting, I don't know, pity. I just looked back at him. "You did this to yourself," I said. You threw my life onto the street in the middle of winter on New Year's Eve because you were greedy. You thought the law didn't apply to you. You were wrong. I took the new keys from the locksmith, walked to my apartment door, asterisk my door, and unlocked it. The last thing I saw was Harrison standing in the hallway, his hands on his head, a man completely defeated by his own actions. Harrison's entire house of cards collapsed. The bank moved with ruthless efficiency, appointing a receiver to take control of my building while they pursued foreclosure. Over the next few months, his other buildings, also drowning in violations from our collective complaints, suffered the same fate. His little real estate empire was gone. The DA's office did eventually press charges, and he was hit with a massive fine and probation. But his real punishment was financial ruin. All because he couldn't resist being cruel on one New Year's Eve. As for me, I didn't stay in that apartment for long. The court-ordered settlement gave me enough money to find a new, better place on my own terms. The old apartment was tainted, but moving out this time felt different. It wasn't an expulsion. It was a choice. It was a victory lap. The most important thing I gained wasn't the money. It was the knowledge that the system asterisk can asterisk work. It's slow and it's complicated, and you have to be willing to fight. But a landlord is not a king, and a lease is not just a piece of paper. The law can be a shield, but you have to be willing to pick it up and use it. What started on the worst night of my life became the most empowering month of my life. Harrison thought he was just evicting one person. He had no idea he was creating an enemy who knew how to read, how to research, and how to connect the dots. He tried to make me a victim, but instead, he made me a fighter. And in the end, his attempt to take my home on New Year's Eve cost him everything by the time the dust began to settle in January. This whole ordeal taught me that knowledge is power, especially when it comes to your home. So many of us don't know our rights, and landlords are counting on that. If this story was satisfying, or if you learned something, please hit that like button and subscribe to Karma Chronicles for more stories about justice. And I really want to hear from you. What would you have done? Have you ever had a nightmare landlord? Share your story in the comments. Let's make sure no one else has to feel as alone as I did on that cold New Year's Eve. In the end, this isn't a revenge story. It's about accountability. It's about the fact that no one should be above the law, no matter how much money they have. Mr. Harrison learned that lesson the hard way. Know your rights, document everything, and never let a bully make you feel powerless. Your voice is so much stronger than you think. Thanks for watching.